Hello, welcome to the Parable Man. I'm Jeremy Pierce, the Parable Man, and I'm recording another video today. What I've decided to do for this installment is some material that I put together uh, quite a while ago from the philosopher and theologian Augustine of Hippo, who lived from the second half of the fourth century into the very early years of the couple decades about into the fifth century, so something like 350 to 420 or something like that. Uh, Augustine was from North Africa. His father was a Roman citizen and official, and his mother was a local. People from that region were called the Berbers, Berber, and Augustine was a he was raised in Christianity by his mother. His father was a pagan, but his father was traveling a lot and didn't have a huge role in his upbringing until, uh, well, really not at all. I mean, he was around a little bit here and there, but his mother was much more formative in his development, and he was raised as a Christian and rejected it in his young adulthood for several years at least, and eventually came back under the influence of Ambrose of Milan, who at the time was in Rome. He hadn't been made a bishop yet in Milan. And one of Augustine's friends, his father paid for him to get a classical education in Rome, and studied philosophy there, and came to connect with people from very different backgrounds, very pluralistic society, much like our own today. And he tried out a bunch of things. He encountered Manichaeanism and held that for a while and rejected it. He moved toward Platonism for a while, which for Platonists for that period of time would have been what we today call Neoplatonism. It wouldn't have been Plato himself, and ultimately rejected that and returned to Christianity. One of his friends said, "Hey, there's this guy, the local parish priest down the road named Ambrose. He's actually pretty smart, and I think you'd like him." And Augustine went and tried out a service and listened to Ambrose preach, and actually was impressed. And he kept going, and eventually was won back to the Christian faith, and became joined up as a priest, and eventually became a bishop and had a large role in some major controversies during his lifetime, uh, including the Pelagian controversy, most notably. But one of the things that as I was teaching through Augustine years ago, it occurred to me would be a really interesting issue to try to think through and teach was Augustine's social and political thought. And it's not like what we would think of as political thought today. He's not going to tell us what the best form of government is. That was totally not interesting to him. He doesn't ever discuss the best form of government, like Plato and Aristotle had done, for example. He's not really interested in political questions for their own sake. He's interested in God's role in history, including among nations and rulers who would range from good rulers to bad rulers. He does think there are ethical questions about how to govern, and he's interested in how Christians, as part of a political entity, should live and participate. He's living in a time when Christianity has become become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Constantine earlier had declared it legal. That stopped the persecution, but it wasn't the official religion until the Emperor Theodosius. And Augustine was alive at the time Theodosius declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then there was this massive attack from the Gauls, who sacked Rome and did a bunch of absolutely awful things to Roman citizens, as happens in time of war and destruction of cities and things like that. And the pagans of the time blamed the Christians because the gods were mad because they'd rejected them in favor of Christianity. And Augustine wrote his most famous lengthy work called City of God as a response to that. So the full title of the book is The City of God Against the Pagans, and some of what we're talking about today relates to that title. So his ultimate concern, though, is not politics as we understand that today. It's not about what the best form of government is or particular policies that we should implement. when we get political, when we're interested in political questions today. His ultimate concern is the relation between what he calls the city of God and its manifestation in people who follow Jesus Christ. That's one side. And then the other side is the earthly city and the mindset that that fosters. So when he says the city of God or the earthly city, he doesn't mean a city. He means a people. He means, the city of God is a reference to the biblical concept of the people of God, but it's also a reference to the reign of God, which in Greek is the same word for kingdom. And so when you see in the New Testament Jesus talking about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, the most biblical scholars today would recognize that a better translation of that is the reign of God, the rule of God. And it's not the same thing as the church. It's also not the same thing as the people of God, but it's tied up with it. It's connected with that. The people of God are the city of God, the reign of God, the rule of God. All those are tied up together. That's the people who follow Jesus Christ. And then everyone else is the earthly city. That's how he's thinking of it. So this includes those in government, because in Augustine's time, you were having Christians now in government, right? So they are in government. They are ruling in the earthly city, literally, right? But they are also, their primary loyalty is to the city of God. And he does have things to say about that. So, but his big picture is really the rule of God and the role of Christians in society. It's not as much about law and policy as it is about how do we interact as Christians with a world that has rejected God, that has rejected the Bible. And he lived in a time with much diversity. So this is not Thomas Aquinas in high medieval Europe in the early universities where nearly everyone is professing to be a Christian. This is Augustine in the late stages of the Roman Empire, where you have an extremely diverse set of people around you. So it's much like the world that we live in today in that way. So Augustine thinks of God as the governor over all creation. Nothing happens without at least God's permission. And I don't want to get into the whole debate of free will and predestination and all that sort of thing too much, but Augustine clearly believes in a high view of God's sovereignty over everything that happens. Nothing is going to happen without God's permission. Nothing surprises God. It's all part of God's plan in some sense. And there's an ordering of events that God has conceived of from eternity. It's a very strong view of God's sovereignty that requires him to say something about the problem of evil. That was his big struggle. That was why he left the Christian faith to begin with. And the Manichaean view had a different approach where there's two gods, one good and one evil, and neither one will ever win over the other. One of the things that dissatisfied him about that was that there's no hope of victory. There's no hope of an end to injustice and that sort of thing. And the Platonic view that he turned to after that had no personal God at all, really. And so he certainly, after he's come back to the faith, and as he develops his theology over the years, everything that happens is somehow in God's plan. That doesn't mean that everything that happens is intrinsically good. He doesn't think that. There's bad things to happen. And sometimes God allows bad things to happen to serve a greater good, or whatever it might be the reason. There is a reason in every single case, though. So it fits into a larger plan somehow that God is in control of. And that's standard Christian doctrine. You're not going to find a Christian who actually believes the Bible who doesn't believe that. You may have variations in how it works, Calvinism, Arminian, Wesleyan models, and so on. But you're not going to find a Christian who doesn't believe that in some sense. The ones that call themselves Christians who do, open theists who think that things surprise God, God doesn't know what's happening in the future, and so on, I think are departing significantly from what the Bible itself teaches. Some of them may be genuine Christians, and I know some that I think are, but I think they've departing significantly from the teaching of the Scriptures. So, and historically, pretty much Christians over time until like the 20th century, when you started to get among intellectuals, academics, philosophers, you started to get this idea of open theism. But on the ordinary level of most people, the Christian view has always been God is sovereign and not surprised by anything, and everything that happens is part of God's plan. So everything that happens, that means that Donald Trump is part of God's plan. It also means that Barack Obama and Joe Biden were part of God's plan. George W. Bush was part of God's plan. So was Bill Clinton, and so on. It means that the Holocaust was in some sense part of God's plan, and so was American slavery. Christians who believe that have things that they have to think through in terms of the problem of evil and all that. That's obviously something that's part of this, but nevertheless, that is Christian doctrine, basically. That means that God distributes worldly power, ruling over people ruling over people, irrespective of whether people are good or bad. Just as God distributes good to everyone, God distributes power to particular people. And if only good people got it, then people would expect such gifts from God if they're good. And that would be, Augustine argues that that's not, then we would see worldly power as important, and we shouldn't. So that's one reason he thinks God distributes worldly power, irrespective of whether people are good. Some people who are in power are good, some are not. Some abuse their power, and so on. They do have a responsibility, Romans 13 says this very clearly, to use their power for good. But worldly power is not of any real importance in the end. Yes, you can have lots of effect on people and cause great good and great harm, but ultimately that's not what's important. What's important is their spiritual connection with God. So God would not be promoting worldly power as more important than it actually is, and only giving it to good people would be promoting it more than it actually is. So it's an interesting argument. So he expects that worldly power is going to get distributed among people of various sorts to diminish the likelihood of people drawing that kind of conclusion. He looks to the Hebrew scriptures, sees promises of land, physical things to Israel. He tries to reinterpret all that as having just a hidden meaning in spiritual reality, the spiritual land being in God's kingdom as a citizen of a higher reality. Those in the city of God, in his time and today, Christians are not citizens of the earthly kingdom, do not primarily identify with it in terms of its mindset or its desires. So that's kind of the picture there, and I think he kind of overstates that. The promises, there are promises throughout the scriptures, including not just the Torah of the land, but in Proverbs, throughout Proverbs, generally speaking, if you do good, you're going to have good things happen to you, and things like that. But you also see throughout the scriptures a tempering of that. Jesus says, expect persecution, expect to be treated the way I'm being treated. They don't accept me, they're not going to accept you, and they're going to treat you harshly, right? Both of those threads are common throughout the scriptures, and they're not contradictory, because there's both of them can be true at the same time. That there might be generally good consequences of good things that you do. If you live a certain way, it's going to go better for you, on average, in general, right? But it's not a promise, and it's not an absolute. It is a general tendency, right? But there are also general tendencies. If you live in a way that's contrary to the world is not going to accept you and might even mistreat you, right? So I think Augustine pushes more toward the side away from the physical side as being a good outcome of the things we do. I think he's getting that wrong, but it's not as if the other stuff is not there. They're both there, and so in any case, that's kind of the framework he's working with here. He sees the worldly city, the earthly city, as something that's in opposition to the city of God that all Christians belong to. And we shouldn't be identifying with it. We shouldn't be identifying with its mindset. We shouldn't be identifying with its desires. There are things that it cares about that shouldn't be our primary concern. He's going to temper that a bit. He's going to take that back a little bit. But that's one theme that you see in his work. And he defines a people as a group united by common goals, purposes, loves, that sort of thing. In some way, he's getting this from the Roman senator Cicero, who was one of his philosophical heroes. Cicero was a senator at the time of Julius Caesar. Caesar was paranoid about some of these senators not liking him, and he exiled a bunch of them from Rome so that they couldn't be agitators against him. People who seize power illegitimately are often that sort of thing. And Cicero ended up spending a lot of his years just writing philosophy, because his career as a senator was pretty much not going to be a possibility anymore. And he's one of our best sources about the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the skeptics of that period. Uh, so Augustine read a lot of Cicero and talks about him a lot. Cicero's definition is that a society is a group united for the sake of serving justice. Augustine doesn't want to define it that way, because you can evaluate a people based on what its goals, purposes, and loves are. And if they don't love justice, they're still a people, right? So if it loves good things, it makes it a good people. If it loves bad things, it's a bad people. So you can't define a society as a group with good goals, because not all groups are then societies in that way. He wants to define groups with shared interest as a society. So some societies might be united by justice, others might not be. Rome, in its most corrupt state, was still a people. True justice isn't present unless reason triumphs over what's not excellent. Ultimately, the best sort of justice, a people must love God. But it might make sense to speak of lesser forms of justice that involve something more virtuous than another people. So we're talking relatively here. This people is more virtuous than this other people with respect to that particular virtue, right? You might see one virtue more common among one group than another, right? For example, timeliness is probably more present in Germans than it is in, I don't know, Latin Americans. I don't know. The Latin Americans tend to be more open-ended about their time, right? So the virtue of timeliness is probably more common in Germany. But you're going to find more acceptance of people being late, and therefore more forgiveness and more kindness toward people about those issues among Latin Americans, right? So you're going to find different virtues highlighted among different people because it's more their culture to be that way, right? And you're going to have some societies that are more on board with the kinds of things that come when you love God than other societies, ones that have been more influenced by Christianity or the gospel, for example. He expects to find more virtues of the sort that are particular to Christianity in those societies. But nevertheless, they're only relatively better. They're not absolutely better, because no one is absolutely good. No one is perfect. And so you can talk about relative goodness, but absolute goodness, no one has. We all fail. And that's part of the gospel message. No one can be connected with God in the most important ways unless God reaches out to us and makes a pathway for us to do so. And the pathway that God has done so is through repentance and following him and trusting in the cross and Jesus for our salvation. That's the gospel message. And so he makes a distinction between true peace that only the city of God looks forward to, and it's not going to happen in this life, but there's a semblance of peace that you can have in the earthly city. And it corresponds to a distinction between true justice that will only occur when we're fully and completely motivated by the love of God. That won't happen with still sinning members of the city of God here and now. It will only happen in the end, in the afterlife. But we can still have a semblance of justice in the earthly city. Some things are more just than others, even though they're not perfectly just. Augustine's defense of his claim that unjust regimes are no more than criminal gangs on a large scale. It's a really interesting defense of this. So unjust regimes are no more than criminal gangs on a large scale. An unjust government is nothing more than a bunch of criminals. The fact that they have much power and get to be called an empire makes no difference whatsoever. The thing they have in common is that they're organized around a common purpose. And in these cases, it's a bad purpose. His emphasis here is that empires can be no better than gangs. One is a smaller group, one is a larger group, but they're both organized around evil. And so that means that a gang is also like a small-scale society, right? A society that's evil is like a large gang. A gang is like a small society. They have a common association that a society also has. It's just they're a smaller group. The organizing principle doesn't line up with what's right. That doesn't mean it's not a society. It's a bad society. It is a society, though. So even a little gang of criminals is a society. what are the desires of the earthly kingdom? What is he saying are these evil desires? Well, his view of the earthly kingdom is not far from what Epicurus would say they are. Epicurus was a philosopher from the time of Alexander the Great, a little bit after Alexander the Great, really, and so a Greek philosopher who believed that the world is purely physical. We're just made out of atoms. When we die, that's it. That's the end. And what we ought to do is minimize our pain and suffering. He didn't believe in any positive good. He called himself a hedonist, which suggests that he sees pleasure as intrinsically good, but pleasure is just zero. It's the absence of pain. There's no positive good whatsoever. So your job in life is to minimize your pain and suffering. Try to have as little of it as possible. So you try to avoid distress, you try to avoid hardship, you try to avoid connecting with people and depending on them too much because they could fail you. Try to live a self-sufficient life without much attempt to try to seek pleasure, because when you seek pleasure, you could end up wanting it, and then when you don't get it, it's pain, right? So you're just trying to minimize pain. Animals demonstrate this by avoiding death. They do seek to satisfy their pleasures, but we have reason, and we can do the maximizing of our pleasures and minimizing of our pain and things like that on a more rational level than animals can, because we have reason. But fallen humanity is weak and will not do it well. We will not do it well without God's help. He actually thinks it's impossible to do it without God's help. We need God to transform us, to make us want things that are better. He's committed to the view that we only do the thing we most want to do, and if the thing we want is not the best thing, we're not going to want the better thing, right? We're only going to want the less good thing unless our desires transform, and that takes a miraculous work of God. So God commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the highest thing to want for oneself is to love God fully. It's an equally high goal to want others to love God, from your family members to complete strangers. This also means being at peace with everyone, which requires, on the negative side, seeking to do harm to no one, and on the positive side, seeking to do good to everyone, whenever possible. Someone's own household is the priority because it's closer proximity. And also because society is ordered by families, God has placed us where we are. But anyone you come into contact with is your neighbor, and you ought to love your neighbor. And it's the contact with them that makes it uh, your obligation to show love to someone in particular, because they're in your sphere of influence. They've come under, God has placed them in your life, right? God's placed them in your path, like the Good Samaritan parable. The guy that goes and helps the guy does it because he's the one who found him. That's the only reason. He's the one who happened to find him. Now, he's not the first to find him. The other two didn't help him, right? But in that parable, the guy that helps him, and it feels like it's an obligation to help him, primarily because that's the God placed him in his path, right? So Augustine's social philosophy includes thinking of certain relationships as having priority over others. He looks at biblical passages about children respecting and obeying their parents. He believes in an authority relationship between husband and wife. He does not hold that to be a domineering relationship. He distinguishes that from slave relationships, for example. He actually gives pretty strong arguments against slavery throughout his work, and he particularly gets offended at people who treat their horse better than their slave, because their slave's a human, and human beings have a much higher status. Uh, but he recognizes that some people in his time were enslaved, and they have certain responsibilities as slaves. It's not their job to free themselves from slavery, but it is their job to reach out to those in their life, including their master, with the Christian gospel if they're a Christian, and to love those who are around them. And that was just precisely the teaching of the New Testament. Um, but there's a twist to this, and it comes, again, right out of the New Testament. The people who give orders to others, this is the twist. Uh, the ones who give orders to other people who have authority over them, those are the actual servants. The people who obey them are not the actual servants. Why? Well, because biblical teaching is always that leadership is serving. When you're actually leading someone, you are serving that person. That sounds really weird to modern ears. It also sounded really weird to ancient ears. He was very countercultural with this, but it is the plain teaching of Scripture. So Jesus is very clear that the true leader is the servant, and he modeled that. So is the authority figure the leader? Yes. Are they the most important one? No. Are they the one in charge? In some sense, yes. The subordinates do serve the authority figure in the sense that the authority figure dictates something and then they do it, right? But no, ultimately the servant is the one who leads. The one who leads is a servant if they're doing it well. And the leader is not going to be an ideal leader unless they're serving. They have the responsibility over the interests of those that are being led, and their job is to serve those people, to love them as themselves, and to do what's best for that person. That means giving orders in some cases, but when it's done in an ideal way, it's serving the interests of that person. Um, it doesn't involve the more heightened sense of independence and autonomy that we have today in our political systems, where we see everyone who is a citizen as an equal. You do see a sense of that in Aristotle, but Aristotle doesn't apply that in every case the way people would today either. And Augustine probably never read Aristotle in that stuff anyway. He would have had the logical text of Aristotle translated into Latin, but he probably never read Aristotle in Greek. It's hard to get into this mindset given our egalitarian structures, but everything in his day was structured. Even adults in a family would have older adults in the family who were in some sense authoritative leaders over them. And they would live in large extended family units and things like that. He's not seeking to restructure the social relationships of his day. He's not seeking to reverse how authority figures would think about their positions. But within those structures that existed in his day, he's trying to help people think through how, if I have authority, how do I serve? And it undermines the whole view that those who are in charge are naturally bosses. They're naturally in charge. They're the ones who have ownership over things. And authority means you get to tell everyone else what to do. That's not how he's thinking about this. Relationships of authority are servant relationships. And he does connect relationships of authority to the fall. He thinks of war as an analogy. War can be just, but a just war is just only because there's an enemy that needs to be resisted. Even with a just war, the enemy's doing something wrong. And with a thoroughly unjust war, both sides might be wrong. War doesn't make sense without some evil existing. Slavery, similarly, only comes in because of sin. He thinks of everyone being, in a sense, enslaved to sin. Slavery to sin is not slavery to a person, but it's slavery. And it's the more fundamental and most significant kind of slavery that there is. And what that means is you have your desires wrongly ordered. Virtue is wanting what's best according to how good it is. And if you have your desires all out of order, you want things according to this one thing you want more than the other thing, but it's not as good as the other thing, right? Your desires are all distorted. And that's what evil is. Evil is not wanting what's best. It's what evil in a human being is, not wanting what's best at the best level. And if you had true freedom to do what was really good and you knew what was good, you'd be doing something different, right? So because of evil, people will secure others' obedience for less than good purposes, and they will have leadership over them in various senses. Some of it is as far as slavery, some of it's much less than that. But he thinks all of it is wrong if you're only out there to try to get something out of it. And that's slavery is um, precisely the opposite of what servant leadership should be like. So, but he says the same thing about improper desires for things that are less healthy, desires for things that are less good for you or less good for those around you. If that's what's dominating you and leading you to act, that's bad for you. You're being enslaved to something that is a misvaluing of things, right? A bad desire controls you in a way that's bad for you, for your soul. And a person doesn't control you in a way that does that. So that's a worse form of slavery than slavery to a human being. He sees the height of sin as pride, and the remedy for that is humility, which is another reason being a servant to others can serve people's good, because um, it's all in keeping with that whole perspective. So he argues that unlike Aristotle, there's no reason to think that anyone is naturally a slave. That passage in Aristotle is widely misinterpreted. He's not talking about racial stuff there. The natural slaves for Aristotle are people with cognitive disabilities because they can't make autonomous decisions for themselves. It's still a terrible reason to enslave someone. Aristotle really had that very wrong, but that often is taken in ways that Aristotle didn't intend it. But Augustine doesn't think anyone is naturally a slave or a master. He doesn't defend slavery as a practice. He does say that Christians who are slaves ought to make it an arena of freedom by serving with faithfulness and affection toward those around them and serving their good. And if they're not Christians, trying to win them over with the gospel and things like that. He thinks that furthers the rulership of God over uh, the world, and helps people in the earthly city to come to understand the gospel. He doesn't tell slaves they ought to try to free themselves and things like that. But he says enough stuff that makes it pretty clear he does not approve of slavery. And his line of reasoning ultimately won the day. And slavery was completely removed from Europe for hundreds of years. It didn't come back again until the colonization period, when people needed slave labor to work plantations for tobacco and cotton and various other things. Um, their obligation is for masters to seek to do what's in the interest of their slaves. Ultimately, what's that going to be? You're probably going to be freeing them, as Paul tells Philemon to free Onesimus and treat him like a brother rather than a slave, right? So one of the questions that people sometimes raise about this stuff is this really anything like what we think of as slavery, 19th century plantation slavery in the United States, for example, right? Some of the homes that owned a few slaves may have treated them kindly, but a lot of the large plantations, particularly, were pretty awful. And if you just read slave narratives, you can see all that. There's still people today who try to undermine. I saw someone on social media the other day saying that Roman slavery was far worse than American slavery. There's no way anyone could say that if they actually knew what American slavery was like. Uh, is the thing he's describing, where masters love their slaves and slaves uh, simply do good in that role. Is that something that's possible to do? Is it okay for a Christian to be the slave owner? He doesn't raise that question, but he says enough that makes it pretty clear that there's something messed up about this relationship. And but there are some places where he says ownership of another person is not possible. So it's not like that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, it's a theoretical concept, and yet people do it in practice. So um, the time I think he's talking here as, if this structure is in place and you participate in it, what is your obligation? And I think half the time, or maybe less than half, but at least enough of the time, he's saying enough things that undermine the whole structure of it to make it clear that there's something bad about the structure itself. So I think that's some interesting stuff there. Uh, Punishment. Interesting stuff about punishment. Punishment can be justified if it's in the best interest of the person being justified. You see this line of argument in Plato. Because we have an obligation not to harm others. We have an obligation to do good to people, right? That there's a threat then to the idea of punishing people. Isn't that harming them, right? But if you're helping someone in a bad state to have an incentive to become better, then the idea is you're helping them, right? And that sort of argument is in Plato. Augustine agrees with that line of thought. But he also brings that to a more directly political kind of thing with I mean, we're talking about household, but now we go to cities, right? You have employers, you have slave owners, you have parents, you have different roles in the society, right? Uh, what about the larger institution of the political government over the households and over the individual people, right? Can we justify people being in authority and using force to control, really, right, what people do? How do we, ideally, that's only going to be justified if you're seeking peace in the society and seeking that uh, everyone's good is the goal. So justice should always be your goal in a society. And if we're going to function in a healthy way, that's how we're going to lead if we're in positions of authority, right? But there's always this whole other side to it. We're never going to get there. There's more important things than justice in society, and that's being right with God. So he's always going to come back to that. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do good in the world. That's loving your neighbor. But it does mean there are things more important than that. And I mean, I see people today arguing about these questions, and finding that balance is not easy. People will go to one side of that or the other side of that pretty easily. It's really easy to slip to either side of that. And he would say you got to keep both of those principles in mind. In an earthly city, how do we function? We've got a pluralistic society. He's living in one, right? You've got Christians in government, but you also have other people in government. Is there a way to negotiate that and navigate that, right? How does that work? Well, he sees a society as a compromise between human wills. Human wills are forming the society, right? What makes it a society? You have some commonality, some common purpose that you form as you have a society, right? That's what makes a society a society. Uh, but yet sometimes we have human wills that differ from each other, right? That's what you got to navigate then, right? He has no problem of talking about that as rulers ordering a society, then serving the interests of the people there. But you have to think about the different wills of the people there, the different things that they desire. And they're not all going to be on the same page. The Christians have to recognize those who are not Christians have different goals in mind. And you have to work with them to have a society because they're part of it, right? And that's one of the reasons it will never be perfect, because you're going to have conflicting views on it. You're never going to get to what is going to be the ideal. And I think that's one of the reasons he's not like right up front and saying ban slavery right now immediately, right? He's recognizing that for a society to function, you have to get the different minds involved on board with something, and recognizing that, so that those who are in power who are not on board with that become so. And I mean, really, what he's saying here is not that different than what you see in the time of, say, John Locke, hundreds of years later, uh, the consent of the governed kind of thing, right? Locke goes too far with that, I'm sure Augustine would say, but there's something similar going on here. Um, so there's a need to participate in the surroundings that you have. That's loving your neighbor. Sometimes the city you are in, the earthly city that you are in, is going to be doing evil. And there's a need to participate in those systems because that's what is required to love people. The people of the heavenly city really belong elsewhere, but for now they're here. And they're here with a mission to uh, speak the good news to those who are not in the heavenly city. And that means that there's a need to participate while awaiting the restoration of the ideal state, when those things are no longer necessary. The earthly city and the heavenly city are intertwined. They both seek the same goal of peace, although they have sometimes disagreements on how to get there. And but when the earthly city is more functioning the way it should, it's going to be doing that better. But the heavenly city is also seeking not just the best possibility now, but something greater to come. And that's something that the earthly city does not value. So the members of the heavenly city should seek to obey laws. They should seek to honor authority in the earthly city and observe the kinds of earthly relationships that exist in this life, that will not be necessary in the next life. For example, marriage. Jesus is very clear he doesn't see marriage in the right. We shouldn't think of marriage as a permanent thing. It's until death. And the kinds of earthly relationships in this life are not going to be necessary in the next life, uh, including authority over each other in various ways. But while we're in this life, we should honor those things. And that's entirely biblical teaching right there. It's all through the New Testament. If the laws in the earthly city involve religion and they conflict with the heavenly city's obligation to serve God first and foremost, then the heavenly city's laws take precedence. But this also means the heavenly city couldn't have laws in common with the earth. It means that the heavenly city couldn't have laws in common with the earthly city involving religion. The heavenly city's laws would not serve the interests that the earthly city has carved out for itself. If it really knew what was best for it, it would serve God. It would follow true religion, as James calls it. But everyone serves something, and the earthly city replaces the true God with other things. You got to keep that in mind. And so, in his time, in the early Christian period, Christians are just starting to get in government. This meant that there was still persecution of Christians going on. It wasn't legal like it had been in the very early period, but it was still going on, and um, not as much from the government, but from neighbors, maybe, right? For not following the religious laws of the earthly city. But as Christianity becomes legalism or legal, that starts to disappear. And as Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, that starts to go away much more quickly. But nevertheless, there's still a pluralistic society, people around you with different values, and you got to realize you got to get along with them and seek peace with them. What is that going to look like? It means that you're not going to be putting laws in place that only Christians would approve of. You got to get everyone else on board with it to start doing stuff like that. So those in the heavenly city should follow whatever methods of seeking peace their earthly government allows. That's going to differ from different governmental system to governmental system. If you're in an empire, if you're in a monarchy, if you're in a republic, if you're in a more democratic kind of system, you're going to have different ways of doing that. But it'd be interesting to see what he would say about our time. What would he say? Would he say that we should follow whatever governmental system is in place today, whether it's a monarchy, a democratic socialist society, or a representative republic, right? Or what if you're under a dictatorship of a tyrannical ruler, right? What should be the roles of Christians in a system where all citizens have a role in shaping the policies? Does that change things for him? Well, you also still do have other people, though, who are shaping these laws, right? And I'm sure he would say, play along and further the goal of earthly peace. Do what you can to seek the goals of earthly peace. But he also says Christians don't interfere with the system because that's not their goal. Their goal is to seek peace in whatever way it does it and try to enter into that. But your goal isn't to try to structure things as perfectly as possible. It's to win souls. And you can seek peace while you're doing that. You ought to seek peace while you're doing that. So we should favor policies that seek peace. But would he say that Christians should stay out of politics then? No, I don't think so. Would he advocate basing policies on particularly Christian views, though? I also think the answer to that is no, unless it's something that's widely supported by the surrounding culture. I mean, you can vote for it, I suppose, but don't push hard to do it in a way that the majority is going to be disapproving of it. Because it's not, number one, it's not going to last, and number two, it's just going to be going against the interests of peace. You got to work with these people, figure out how to do things with them, and move in the direction of peace as much as you can, but keeping in mind that they might not be won over to it without a longer time of trying to convince them of it, right? So he calls it a compromise. The earthly city's governing is a compromise, and it's a compromise to begin with. Forget Christianity. You got people from diverse backgrounds. How are they going to work together, right? They got to compromise, right? My role as a citizen of the United States might be to govern in a way that I see will best serve the earthly peace of the United States and its role in the world. Right? And if I'm not a Christian, I have to do that merely on the basis of what seems best to me. If I am a Christian, I have to make my decisions on how I vote, what policies I argue for, on the basis of what I think is correct. I don't think he would say forsake your principles, but I should go along with how the system works, and if a majority favors something I find harmful, I should respect the earthly city's chosen methods of achieving peace, even if I would recommend other ones. And I can certainly recommend other ones. I can certainly do that, right? there's a tension here, but I think it can be resolved. I think the things he's saying are not absolutes. They're recognizing, there's other things complicating this thing. Augustine was not the sort of person who um, I think would do well in our era of social media. I think people would see him as all the things they hate. And I think that's true of people on the left and on the right. But I think he has far more wisdom than they do. I think this perspective generally is really where we should be. This is what we should move toward. So, in any case, that's Augustine on social and political philosophy. And uh, enjoyed working through this material again. I haven't actually taught this stuff in a few years, so it's nice to get into this again. So that's it for today. Have a great time thinking through these questions, and hopefully if you have objections to them, I'm happy to have conversations in various formats with this on the video itself, over social media, and so on. I love to talk about this stuff, and I'd love to have a continuing conversation with anyone who really wants to treat this seriously. So I think this is an important kind of thing to be thinking about in our time, and I think a lot of people are not in as healthy a place with this as Augustine was. So I think this is a very timely kind of video to make, and it's one that I could easily pull out because I already have so much material on. So all right.